Welcome to the 11th video in this review of basic Greek morphology based on 12 core patterns. We continue our review of Greek verbs and now come to the non-indicative moods. In this video, as in the whole series, we'll review the main points and then you can find further details in the book Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. We'll begin with the subjunctive mood, and the subjunctive uses the same personal endings as the indicative, so there's no new endings to learn. The distinctive characteristic of the subjunctive is the long vowels eta and omega. These represent the lengthening of variable vowels and the tense form signs. Here's a sample of a me verb, and notice that the variable vowel epsilon iota lengthens the epsilon to an eta, and the iota is subscripted. And note that some forms are identical with other verb forms. The main one to remember is that eta iota subscript, which is used for both the third singular active and the second singular middle and middle passive forms. The present subjunctive of a me is simply the lengthened variable vowel plus the ending of the present active, along with breathing marks and accents. Moving right along to the optative mood, the distinctive characteristic of the optative is that iota added to the variable vowel or tense form sign. Notice that the secondary endings are used except for the me in the first person singular. The variable vowel in the present is omicron combined with the iota, and in the second singular middle, the ending sigma omicron loses the sigma in both the present and the aorist. In the aorist, the iota is added to the tense form sign sigma alpha. Note that psi ending in the third singular because it's easily confused with the aorist infinitive and imperative, as we'll see a little bit later in this video. In both the present and the first aorist, the third plural active uses an iota epsilon instead of simply an iota. The me verbs use an iota eta in some forms instead of simply an iota. The only form that shows up with any frequency in the Greek New Testament is the third singular active present optative of a me. Now in the imperative mood, that will be recognized by its endings, and so these endings are another of the core patterns to become familiar with. These are the endings you see on verbs as you're reading, but not all of these forms are the actual endings. For example, the second singular active ending is actually a zero form, and this epsilon is the variable vowel. So these endings work for reading purposes, which is the focus of this review. As for all the material in this review of morphology, for a more precise and detailed discussion, see either Funk or Mounts, or both of them. So looking first at the present imperatives for the omega verbs, you see the endings are fairly clear except for the second singular, especially in the contract verbs, where you have the variable vowel contracting with the stem endings. Notice that in the present, the second plurals have the same form in both the imperative and the indicative, so that will be an ambiguity. Looking at some examples of me verbs in the imperative, again it's the second singular endings that call for attention. Histe, in particular, is simply irregular, and it has no ending. The eta is a lengthened stem ending. Moving on to the first aorist, you see all the endings are clear if you know the core pattern. That psi ending can be confused with the optative, as we saw earlier, and also the infinitive that we'll look at pretty soon. The imperative form is used 18 times in the Greek New Testament, the optative 8 times, but the infinitive is used hundreds of times. So pay special attention to the psi ending. The contract verbs in the aorist are easy because the contracts lengthen their stem, so the endings are clear. Here in the second aorist, as well as the aorist passive and the perfect, we have endings that are clear. And the same is true here in the second aorist middle and perfect middle passive. Throughout the aorist, the lack of an augment is a further sign of the imperative. Now let's look at the aorist imperative of some me verbs. Most of the endings are clear, but again the second singular has some forms that need special attention. The pattern for the present imperative of a me should be learned as one of our 12 core patterns. Now we move on in our overview to the infinitive, and it will be recognized by the endings, and so the endings are another core pattern to be familiar with. The bracketed forms are the endings as they most often appear. The endings ni and sthi behave themselves and are easy to recognize. The other ones we'll have to look at a bit. For most purposes you can just learn ain, psi, ni, sthi. But ain is actually the variable vowel epsilon contracted with the infinitive ending epsilon nu in the present. And that's especially important for the contract verbs. So each of those contract endings are the contraction of epsilon nu with the stem ending. You see these infinitive endings on some me verbs fit the core pattern, and the same is true here in the first aorist. The psi ending is the tense form suffix sigma alpha of the first aorist with the infinitive ending iota, and that's that psi ending we've looked at for both the optative and the imperative. The second aorist endings are clear, and so are these active and middle infinitives of some me verbs in the aorist. The endings on the perfect infinitive are also clear from the core pattern. Here's the present infinitive of a me, and that's another one of the patterns to learn. So now let's look at a few examples in passages. I invite you to pause the video and see what you can do with the parsing of these two words. The ending on both verbs is a first plural active. The omega points to the subjunctive, and the hina nails that down, that these verbs should be subjunctives. The sigma in the second verb is the sign of the aorist, and the stem is clear, since it comes from pistuo. The first verb requires some familiarity with principal parts. It's from adon, and adon serves as the aorist of horao. Since subjunctives don't have an augment, the stem is id, iota delta. So if you know the principal parts of this verb, this form is regular. This verb is one of the 10 in the Greek New Testament that use more than one root for its principal parts. For a list of the principal parts of these 10 verbs, see page 73 in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. As you're becoming more familiar with the more difficult forms, you'll find help in Danker's Concise Lexicon and Newman's Concise Dictionary, as well as the websites such as BibleHub.com and Perseus that we've seen in earlier videos, especially back in video 3. Now see what you can recognize in this word. Here the T ending points to a second singular middle or passive imperative, and the theta eta then nails it down to an aorist passive form. And here's the lemma. How about these two words? The endings on both these verbs point to active infinitive forms, and there's no tense form sign, so they're most likely presents, but they could be second aorist. So you need to look them up in the lexicon to be sure. And the lemmas show them to be presents. The circumflex on poiein is because it's a contract verb. That information is not usually necessary in order to find a word in a lexicon. In this case, the only other verb in a New Testament lexicon that begins with pi omicron iota is poimaino. This form may be a bit more challenging. It looks like a second declension noun or adjective in the nominative plural masculine. There is indeed a noun that would match, but that wouldn't make sense in the structure of this sentence, because here we already have a nominative form, and it's the singular medes. You may well need help from Danker or Newman or one of the websites if you've not learned that phi alpha gamma is one of the roots which serve as the principal parts of estheo. That's another one of those 10 verbs that have more than one root for their principal parts. So if we view this form as a verb, then the omicron iota is the variable vowel which points to an optative, and the ending's a zero form. So we have a third singular active aorist optative. So even when the endings are regular, some forms may be difficult to recognize. Learning the 12 core patterns and how they're applied goes a long way towards being able to parse the words you encounter, and then through continued reading you build up your familiarity with forms that are more challenging. Here's one last example. Here the ending is clearly a second plural active, and the alpha before the ending may point to a contract verb, and that's confirmed in the lexicon, since the lemma is erunao. So this is a second plural active present, but is the mood indicative or imperative? This form could be either one. So you have to sort it out from the context. In this case, the context could go either way. Jesus may be commenting on these Jewish authorities that they're searching the scriptures because they think that they have eternal life in them, or he may be telling them to search the scriptures. Here's a summary of what we've seen in this video. The subjunctive and optative have personal endings that form a core pattern. The key sign of the subjunctive is the lengthened variable vowel to an omega or eta. Key sign of the optative is that iota before the ending. Key sign of the infinitive is its endings, another one of the 12 core patterns, and the same is true of the imperatives. The present imperative and infinitive of me are two of the core patterns to know well.